Silent Hill originally came about when Konami got its rejects and troublemakers all together, locked them in a room and told them to make a game with an American feeling. They then read a bunch of Stephen King, watched a bunch of David Lynch, and played some Resident Evil. The rest is history, right? Well, no. If things were that simple, you wouldn't be here. Team Silent consisted of Japanese developers, and American feeling or not, the work they produced was bound to reflect this. Silent Hill has some uniquely Eastern ideas about how to connect the emotion to the story. To the layman, it's just Carrie and Pet Sematary mixed with Twin Peaks. You have the psychic girl who is abused by her crazy religious mother, you have the mysterious land with the power of resurrection, and you have the dreamlike ambience resonating throughout it. But those elements are the means by which the series' message is conveyed, not the ends. And in this video, we'll be looking at these lost themes of Silent Hill. The original trilogy of games have a famously hard-to-crack narrative running throughout, which didn't exactly help with getting across the more subdued subtext. Because of this, I'm gonna give you a brief summary of the stories so we're all on the same page when we get to the meat of this video, but for those already in the know, you can skip to this timestamp if you don't need a refresher. Silent Hill 1 is a mystery story where the player is put into the shoes of Harry Mason and tasked to find his daughter Cheryl after the duo got separated in a car crash. Pretty quickly, the horrific nature of Silent Hill, the town Harry found himself in after the crash, makes itself known, and in searching for Cheryl, the player will also learn about a young girl called Alessa and the sad state of affairs that was/is her life, and the cult run by her mother, which attempted to use her to birth their god. Their plans were set back during a birthing ritual where a boiler exploded and nearly put Alessa down, but the fetus within her refused to let her die that day. She split her soul in two to make it impossible to retry the ritual, and the other half of her is Cheryl. Years later, Dahlia conducted a ritual to lure Cheryl back to town, which explains why we were traveling there in the first place. So, Alessa decided to try to use Cheryl to spread the seal of Metatron in order to stop, once again, the birth of the cult's god. But Harry is duped by Dahlia into believing that it's actually the mark of Samael, and she uses him to stop Alessa's efforts, leading to a final confrontation at the end where Harry fights against whichever final boss the player got. The first game also has a running side story of a drug managed by the cult called PTV and the mysterious substance Aglaophatis, a red liquid which has the power to dispel evil spirits. Silent Hill 2, like the first game, is a mystery story, but rather than tracking the exploits of another, the player is gradually unlocking the repressed memories of the protagonist, James Sunderland, who was drawn to the town after he murdered his wife. This time around, there's no cult, so the source of the supernatural happenings is the inherent spiritual power of the town. It draws to it those who house darkness in their hearts, and during this adventure, we will come to meet two such people in Eddie and Angela. The former shot his bully and killed his dog, and the latter murdered her father after years of sexual abuse. There's also Laura, a young girl who knew James's wife in the hospital and believed that when she said goodbye to her, when she said she was far away in a quiet, beautiful place, that she meant that she was going back to Silent Hill, where she and James once vacationed. Laura made her way here to find her and is therefore different from the other characters in that she isn't carrying darkness with her. Finally, there's Maria, a look-alike of James's dead wife who turns out to be a psychological manifestation of his. She and Pyramid Head, a monster which haunts/guides James throughout the game, seemingly form a duo in that both of them are teaching James to confront his guilt for what he did to his wife. In the end, James meets Maria, who has acquired the full appearance of his wife Mary, and after he rejects her, she transforms into a demon-looking thing, the two fight, after which we see James and Mary have a conversation where the ending of the game is revealed to the player. Like its predecessor, Silent Hill 2 has more than one ending. Silent Hill 3 breaks from the narrative tradition it inherited in that it doesn't really tell a mystery story, provided that the player has gone through the series in a chronological order. There aren't a lot of new discoveries to be found here, relating specifically to Alessa's backstory. Rather, This game is another more personal story, like Silent Hill 2 was, focusing on the final reincarnation of Alessa Gillespie, Heather Mason. The cult from the first game returns as the primary villain, who conduct a ritual to impregnate Heather with their god, leading to her having to chase them down to Silent Hill to stop their plans. It is the fetus within her that causes the horrific manifestations this time around, so the nature of the horrors we see is specific to her, like they were for Alessa in the first game and James in the second. During the course of this game, Heather loses her father, Harry, and comes to know the backstory of Claudia. She learns of the relationship Claudia and Alessa had when both of them were little girls, and in the end she confronts the god of the cult for the final time in the series, and once again, the player is assigned an ending depending on their performance. The three lost themes, actually just themes I find aren't addressed enough in the Silent Hill discourse, but you know, catchy title and all that. The three lost themes of Silent Hill are purity and the larger idea thereof, reincarnation, and love. Jeremy Blostein, the translator of the series and the director of the voice actors, specifically cited Mary Shelley's novel Purity and Danger when he was asked about the horrors of Silent Hill, and the idea there has to do with boundaries and the human reaction to them being crossed. That's a Western take on the idea, but in Japan, there's a word which conveys the idea Team Silent was going for with a bit more specificity. Keigare. The following is a crude example, but humor me. Feces are not disgusting when they are inside the body, because that's their proper place. Same goes for blood. Bugs and dirt are outside phenomena, which is why we don't like seeing them inside, which is why we take off our shoes. There are strict boundaries for different components of our lives, and in the extremes, these boundaries have profound spiritual ramifications. But if you aren't familiar with Japanese Shinto, like me, Aesir Senpai, then this idea might not have jumped out at you. Silent Hill's fog was famously a workaround for a limited draw distance, but it also has thematic importance since it's representative of the series' blurring of the boundary between dreams and reality. When sacred boundaries are crossed, or when they become muted, you get impurity. You get keigare. The three themes I noted are not mutually exclusive, far from it in fact, they often beef each other up and intersect in interesting ways. Reincarnation is tied to the idea of impurity because it also has to do with the crossing of boundaries, life and death. The town of Silent Hill has the power of resurrection, which I believe is an idea taken from Stephen King's Pet Sematary. In that story's lore, there is a plot of land which the indigenous people used to bury their dead. Those buried there would return, but after some time, the land went sour, so the natives stopped using it. What they put in was no longer what came back up. As someone once put it, sometimes dead is better. Reincarnation is present in all three of the original Silent Hill games, but interestingly, it isn't completely bad like it was in the book, which I think inspired it, and I think that's because Team Silent, being composed of Japanese developers, had a uniquely Japanese perspective on this. So reincarnation, rather than being an unholy crossing, like in Western philosophy, is just kind of a natural thing. Buddhism teaches that reincarnation is the inherent way of things, and that the only way to escape from the cycle of reincarnation is to achieve enlightenment. Finally, love is something we'll talk more about later, because since I brought up Pet Sematary and the inherent spiritual power of the town, I think we need to explore how these themes run through the backstory of Silent Hill. Long ago, the land was referred to as the place of the silent spirits, by the natives who used it to conduct their rituals. Those natives were pushed out when the first European settlers came to America. Those settlers brought with them their religion and came into contact with the power of the town, and the exchange tainted both. In this land there were witch burnings and other harmonious activities, and eventually the land was depopulated because of a strange epidemic. In keigare terms, that's very fitting. I noted how impurity connects to the blurring and crossing of boundaries, but keigare can also mean corruption and defilement. For example, the presence of a corpse corrupts the environment around it because a corpse is a seedbed for maggots and other impurities, real and spiritual. If you touch it, you will also get keigare, becoming unable to live in harmony with nature, and you'll spread it until you can clean yourself. The land used to have a harmonious relationship with humans, but when the new settlers arrived and brought with them divine taboos, by the standards of the land's power at least, that defiled the land, leading to the epidemic which wiped the settlement out. The epidemic was what grew from the seedbed of impurity, which resulted from the unharmonious living of the new settlers. The next settlement of the land coincided with a civil war, where it was used to house a penal colony. The Silent Hill prison was constructed, and if the manifestation of it we see in Silent Hill 2 is anything to go by, then this was a pretty horrid place, which would have brought with it a lot of corruption, Kegare style. And again, there is a strange disease which takes the land. This time, however, it is not abandoned. The inhabitants construct the Brookhaven Hospital, which was later repurposed as a mental health facility. This is important because it means that the land is perpetually inhabited from now on, and for the Kegare theme, that means stagnation. In nature, flowing waters originate from the heavens as rain and make life possible. They form into rivers that flow, and that flow cleans out impurities in the land. It also moves necessary minerals to where they need to go. When waters move, they are a conduit for life. There are ecosystems dependent on the continued flow of water. Flowing water is life, and so it is good. Conversely, still waters are death. They are where the aforementioned impurities wind up. The stillness means they aren't removed, rather they just sink and begin to rot. It is in still waters where parasites hatch their eggs, because they won't be carried away in a stream. Still waters do not have any mechanism to clean themselves, they are a stagnant pool of rot. They are Kegare. Moving from the water analogy back to the story of the town, the land was once inhabited by impure elements, and once the rot became sufficient enough, it was released as an epidemic which cleaned out the cause of corruption. The second time around, the disease came but was treated, and so the defilement isn't cleaned out, it stacks on top of itself, which has serious consequences for the town moving forwards. In Silent Hill 2, we learn of a boat which sank into Toluca Lake. It was called the Little Baroness, and we can hear its horn when we travel down the tunnel in the Historical Society. It sinks almost 100 years prior to the events of the game, and 14 people on board died in the incident. That their rotting corpses are still in the bottom of the lake would make it so that the lake itself becomes a source of Kegare, which is important because it is from the lake that the fog rises, and since the fog permeates everything in the town, you could read that as impurity having been imbibed by the town itself. Finally, on Toluca Lake, Masahiro Ito, the game's monster designer, noted that for Silent Hill 2, he created Pyramid Head with the in-water ending in mind. That's the one where James came to Silent Hill in order to commit suicide, and that he ends his life in a large body of water is very fitting because he is a murderer. He is spreading Kegare until he can atone for his taboo violation, and in the in-water ending, he fittingly becomes one with the water, which is a source of corruption. If you think that I'm reading too much into things, note that tying defilement and corruption to still water is very prevalent in Japanese horror. See Ringu, where Satoko emerges from a well. Wells house stagnant water and she was defiled before being murdered. Or see Dark Water, where Mitsuko drowned in a water tank. Kegare and Kegare and Kegare. If you are engaging with Japanese media and you see stagnant water, if you see a still body of it housing parasites and leeches, assume Kegare. With that in mind, we're ready to talk about the Otherworld. The Otherworld is the most prominent showcase of the crossing of boundaries in these games. In the first game, the imagery of death and decay permeate the entire Otherworld, and it's a corrupted manifestation of Alessa's mind mixed with a religious iconography of the European settlers who first tainted the land. In the manifestations, we come to know Alessa's innocence. The enemies we face are pulled from her favorite novels. In the environments, we come to know Kegare. Alessa's abuse lives on in the Midwich Elementary School, it lives on in Alchemilla Hospital, and there is a prominent visual motif of parasites and insects. When natural boundaries are disrupted, and when divine taboos are committed, you get Kegare, which can cling to people as well as places, and what's more, Kegare isn't a curse placed on you. You can acquire it by accident, and from no fault of your own, as is the case for Alessa Gillespie. In Silent Hill 1, we are visiting the sites of her abuse and we see impurity in them. We see the nurses who worked on Alessa become hosts to parasites. Note also that parasites and insects are linked to Kagare in the creeper enemy, in the bloodsucker monster in the hospital, which is drinking from a puddle of blood, the parasite, which comes to control Sybil, the wormhead, dog enemies, and the Twin Feeler boss fight. The Twin Feeler and the Butterfly boss are contextualized in-game as being manifestations of Alessa's fascination with butterflies, see her butterfly collection, and in all 3 games this imagery shows up. In the second game, Maria has a butterfly tattoo. In the third game, there is a puzzle involving moths. And this is important because butterflies and moths are symbolic of rebirth. Silent Hill 1 really leans into insect imagery when it comes to presenting rebirth, and more noticeably impurity. When it comes to Silent Hill 2, however, impurity is characterized with water. It's seen in the main menu. It's the backdrop to James's reading of Mary's letter in the opening of the game. It's represented in the fog. After the first boss fight against Pyramid Head, he leaves by literally walking down a flooded staircase. We meet Maria near the lake. We have to sail across to Luca Lake itself to reach the Lakeview Hotel. The basement level there is flooded, which is notable because the hotel itself burned down. And finally, we have the aforementioned in-water ending. And when we transition to Silent Hill 3, water is replaced with blood. Remember, Kagare doesn't have to be symbolized with water, it's just often the case that it is. But it is the crossing of sacred boundaries and the spiritual corruption that comes from it. Anything that can be a seedbed for filth, and anything that invites the crossing of sacred lines is Kagare, and for Silent Hill 3, this is childbirth. Kagare is not a moral denunciation. You can get it even from doing good things, so childbirth might be a good thing, though the one in Silent Hill 3 is anything but that it involves the crossing of physical boundaries makes it unclean. Same goes for periods, and all of a sudden, Silent Hill 3 doesn't seem like quite the backpedal in the psychological horror department from its immediate predecessor like it is often said to be. Sure, things are more visceral this time around, but I feel that's warranted in the change of topic material and in the change of perspectives. More on that in a bit. Silent Hill 2 cooled things down from the first game, literally. The other world in Silent Hill 2 is very dark and cold, whereas here, we're back to the first game's bloody rust aesthetic. But when I say Silent Hill 3 swaps the second game's water for blood when it comes to the key imagery for showcasing impurity, I don't just mean it in a philosophical context. The main menu image is very red. Heather wakes up from her nightmare bathed in a red sunlight, which the developers note as being representative of something red awaiting her. We have a section in the amusement park where we literally run away from a red fog, and the story is about an unwanted pregnancy. The cult performs a ritual to impregnate Heather against her will, meaning she is defiled, meaning she has Kagare. The imagery of impregnation and pregnancy include the split worm boss fight, which is about the most phallic visual in any of these games. It includes the glutton, which might be symbolic of a writhing fetus in utero, though some think it represents the female reproductive system. We have the missionary and the scrapers, who symbolize abortions. And an important uniting feature of these phenomena is their violent presentation. As for why this pregnancy theme, I go back to what I said earlier about Silent Hill 3 having a different perspective from Silent Hill 2. The third game has a feminine sensibility to psychological horror, so rather than face hypersexualized mannequin legs representative of sexual frustration, Heather faces stalkers. She, like Maria in the second game, colors her hair, as we can see in the roots, and the general idea of body image is also shown in the insane cancer enemies and in Heather's disliking of mirrors, etc. The second game had a very masculine drive. James's, Eddie's, and Angela's backstories all explored the idea of masculinity and the failure of men to do the right thing. Failures as protectors, which is an idea which returns in the third game. With the possible exception of Harry, every man in the game shows himself to be a failure when the time comes for them to step up and do the right thing. Vincent and Douglas both independently try to stop Claudia but get their ass handed to them, and Leonard is used to juxtapose against Harry as the reason for why the daughters land in opposition to each other. Harry loved and nurtured Heather. Leonard did not do the same for Claudia. He corrupted her with his religion, and what do you know, he is literally located in a pool of stagnant water. Incidentally, the entrance to his fight arena is an oblong hole, and the Book of Lost Memories notes that those are symbolic of vaginal canals, and that same shape is used as the entrance to the final boss, just violently ruptured. Near the end of the game, Heather drinks a Glophodus and vomits out the god fetus, making it Kegare as it crossed the natural boundary from inside to outside. Then, Claudia ingests it, absorbing the impurity, and births God. God with Alessa's face, which is very, very important. In Brookhaven and in the amusement park, we saw the lingering madness of Alessa that resides within Heather. Those instances were both manifested internally. This time, we see Alessa's face on a creature that Heather did not create. This god was born from Claudia, and that it carries Alessa's face indicates that with the Aglaphidus, Heather has expunged the impurity from her being. She has been purified. Final note on the god boss, she is missing every organ below the chest. Literally missing her reproductive organs. In the Book of Lost Memories, the many circles in Silent Hill 3 are explained to be representative of the idea of rebirth. Be it the giant spinning fans, the teacup rights, or the valves which Valtiel spins. And those valves, those are symbolic of his role as God's attendant, as he quite literally controls the flow of resurrection. Note again the idea of flow. These circles and the idea of reincarnation extend to the Buddhist idea about enlightenment, which I noted earlier, which is also addressed in-game with the message on the closer's head that references the Lotus Sutra. This is an important sutra in Buddhism, partly because it introduced into the religion the idea of skillful means, and partly because it contains the final teaching of the Buddha. When it talked about skillful means, it united all schools of Buddhism into one. The idea is that there is no one path to enlightenment, and there is also not one way to practice Buddhism. A boat may be a good tool to cross a river, but when you're climbing a mountain, it won't help you much. In the same way, geography and culture and other elements may hinder the practice of Buddhism in some way, and so the religion is moldable to its environment. The core pillar remains the same, the goal of achieving enlightenment is the same, but the path can be unique to each individual to best suit their ability to experience it. So, I've talked a lot about impurity in this video, and I've also talked a lot about reincarnation. The final theme I promised to go over was love, and here goes. I think that the Silent Hill series, in a way, uses love as a trade-in for the Buddhist idea of enlightenment. So, in each game in the original trilogy, the protagonist is tested, and the only way they can overcome the challenges that face them and leave the town is if they embrace love. Silent Hill 1 has two endings wherein Harry and Cheryl escape, and in both of them it was because Harry did something in the town to undo Dahlia's plans. That game is very much about paternity, where Dahlia and Harry are pitted against one another as the cruel, abusive mother of Alessa versus the kind and loving father of Cheryl. And in the endings where Harry manages to leave, Alessa chooses him. She hands him a newborn reincarnation of herself before perishing. In the second game, James's motivation for coming to town is canonically retroactive. The final cutscene in the game has James talk to Mary about his guilt for having killed her, and he explains to her how painful it was for him to watch her slowly decay from her disease. He reasons that he did it as an act of love. The way that game distributes endings is based on how you play. If you don't take care of James, if you lose a lot of health and you act with suicidal tendencies, say you observe Angela's knife in your inventory, then James came to Silent Hill to commit suicide, and the final cutscene will end with James picking Mary up. The implication there is that he came to town to commit suicide, a popular kind of suicide in Japan where One spouse, usually the father, will kill his entire family, take them all into his car, and drive off into a lake where he drowns and they can all be reunited in the afterlife. But there are two endings where James leaves Silent Hill. One with Maria, one with Laura. In the Maria ending, she will cough, indicating that she has the same illness that Mary did, meaning she'll die and James will have to repeat the cycle. In the Laura ending, things are more final. James manages to leave his guilt behind and focus his love and attention on her. In the third game, the first's idea of paternity returns, but this time it's child versus child more so than parent versus parent. Claudia and Heather are both the daughters of single men. Claudia's father is Leonard Woolf, and he is juxtaposed against Harry. It's very similar to the first game, where Harry's love triumphs over Leonard's abuse, but there's an added element with a god fetus inside of Heather, because she is an unwilling mother to a child desired by Claudia, and in the end, Heather is able to expel the child by drinking the aglaophatis in the necklace she got from her father, which is when Claudia eats the fetus and births God. Then, in true JRPG fashion, after killing God, Heather manages to leave Silent Hill because of paternal love. Silent Hill was assembled by a uniquely talented crew with a single directive that they make a game with an American feeling. To that end, we have environments lifted from American movies, names from American books, and visuals from Western religions. These games mention the Jewish Kabbalah. They give their own enemies the Hebrew suffix El, and they make sure to assign evil a face familiar to Western audiences. But at its core, it's an Eastern series with an Eastern sensibility. And the uncanny that is created in this disconnect is in large part why these games managed to stay so powerful for all these years. You really appreciate how concise the games are when you play them, even though you might not fully know what is going on. I've done my best to reason why I think these ideas are important to these games, but I am very familiar with the idea that one can read anything into anything. If that is what you feel I've been doing, I hope you at least enjoyed watching me ramble about a series of games that I've spent way too much time with. There really seems to be more to these games than any one video can ever truly talk about, but I hope that going forwards, when you play them, you keep in mind the often lost themes of Silent Hill. Thanks for watching. Videos like this one are made possible by the financial support I receive from viewers like you. I decided to make this video because I've been getting a lot of requests to go back into the Silent Hill well, but since I wasn't quite ready to do another commentary, I hope this sated people's appetites for now. If you enjoyed it, consider chipping in as little as $1 on Patreon or Ko-Fi, and engage with the little buttons below to feed the video to the algorithm. Long-time followers of the channel are familiar with the production schedule I work with, where I swap between working on my game and working on videos. Having released the snail experiment, I feel confident in making the prototype for my game, knowing which elements I want to hone in on, which need to change, and which to add and remove. I'm hopefully gonna have the menu saving and world blueprint done in November, and then, who knows what videos await us in December. Definitely something from software related, and maybe another thing. If you want to get in on the decision-making process for that, subscribe for when the video polls come out. For now, however, I wish you the very best of times. I've been AesirAesthetics, and until next time, thanks for watching.